The stagecoach creaked and moaned as it rattled over the last stretch of hard earth, the wheels cutting long scars into the dust. Evening leaned heavy against the sky, washing the prairie in shades of faded gold and quiet blue. When the coach groaned to a stop at the town's edge, no one rushed to greet it. Only the wind stirred, lifting little whirls of dust that danced like restless ghosts around the wheels. She stepped down, small boots hitting the earth with a soft thud. A girl wrapped in a faded shawl, her dress simple, her hands calloused but careful as they clutched a satchel to her chest. Around her neck, half hidden beneath the modest collar, glinted a small silver cross, catching the last breath of sunlight like a spark desperate to stay lit. Her name was Laura Bullion. She had come across 2 territories and half a dream to be here, riding on the hope written in a letter by a man she had never met but who had promised her a place, a home, maybe even a hand to hold when the nights turned cold. The cross at her throat had belonged to her mother once, a memory strung on a thin chain, worn smooth by years of prayer and grief. It was all she had left from a world that had offered her little but hardship and taught her that kindness, like rain in a drought, was rare and fleeting. The town stretched before her, a haphazard scattering of wooden buildings crouched low against the plains as if afraid the sky might crush them. A saloon leaned tiredly against a mercantile, and across the way, a church stood thin and stoic, its bell silent, its steeple pointing toward heaven like a question no one dared ask aloud. From the porch of the general store, men watched her descend, hats pulled low, boots tapping a slow, suspicious rhythm against the boards. Behind the grimy window of the saloon, a few faces peered out, curiosity mingling with something sharper, something that cut like broken glass under bare feet. Then he came, the man who had sent the letter. Walter Griggs was bigger than she expected, a barrel-chested man with hands like hams and eyes too small for his face. His boots thudded heavily on the ground as he approached, a grimace already carving itself into his features. He looked her up and down with all the warmth of a butcher selecting a lamb for slaughter. "You," he said, voice rough as gravel. "You're the girl?" Laura Bullion lifted her chin, forced her voice to stay steady though her heart knocked hard against her ribs. "I am," she said. "Laura Bullion. I came from Kansas City. I have your letter." She fumbled the folded paper from her pocket, held it out like a peace offering. Griggs didn't take it. His gaze instead caught on the silver cross at her throat. His face twisted, something mean flickering behind his eyes. "You ain't what was promised," he said loud enough that heads turned. "They said you was proper." Laura Bullion's fingers brushed instinctively against the cross, feeling the familiar ridges of it beneath her touch. "I am proper," she whispered, but the words tasted hollow, a prayer lost in a storm. Griggs spat in the dust at her feet. "Not with that thing hangin' off you like some cursed metal. I ain't talking no papist girl into my house. What kind of luck you think that brings?" The words hit harder than fists. She tried to explain, it wasn't about the church, not really, it was about her mother, about memory, about holding on to something when the world kept taking everything else, but no one wanted to hear. In that moment, the cross wasn't a symbol of faith or love. It was a noose the townfolk tightened with their stares. Griggs turned and walked away, his boots throwing up little clouds of dust. A laugh rose from the saloon, sharp and mean. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. Laura Bullion stood frozen, the stagecoach creaking behind her, the town folding itself back into indifference. No one stepped forward. No one offered a hand. The driver of the coach shrugged apologetically, climbed back up onto the box, and with a slap of reins and a whistle, the vehicle pulled away, leaving her standing in the rising dusk like a gravestone no one came to visit. Her knees wanted to buckle but she didn't let them. Instead, she gathered what was left of her pride, set her shoulders, and walked toward the small inn that sagged at the far end of the street. Her boots raised little puffs of dust with each step, and the cross at her throat swung lightly, catching the dimming light, refusing to be hidden. The innkeeper, a wiry man with a tobacco-stained grin, quoted a price she couldn't pay. Laura Bullion counted her coins with trembling fingers and realized she didn't have enough for a room, barely enough for bread. The man shrugged, pointed to a bench outside. "You're welcome to the porch," he said, not unkindly but not kindly either. "Better in the street." She nodded, murmured her thanks and sank onto the bench, the wood pressing cold and splintered against her spine. The sky deepened from gold to bruised purple, and one by one, stars blinked awake overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a fiddle sang a sad tune. Laura Bullion hugged her satchel tight, tucked her feet beneath her skirt, and laid her head against the wall. She wept silently, the kind of weeping that has no sound because it runs too deep, an ache that water cannot cure. She cried for the mother who wasn't here, for the miles of lonely road behind her, for the promise broken before it could even be held. When the cold crept in, she fingered the cross again as she had so many nights before, and whispered the old prayers her mother had taught her. Words about mercy, about being seen, about surviving when the world turned its face away. The wind picked up, sighing through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of dry sage and far-off rain. And somewhere, hidden in the long shadows, a pair of eyes watched her. Eyes that didn't judge. Eyes that saw the girl, not the cross, not the rumors, not the worn dress or the tear-streaked face, but the fierce, trembling heart still beating against all odds. The bench creaked as she shifted, pulling the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She didn't know it yet, but she had already been seen. Not as a burden. Not as a mistake. But as something rare, a flower still blooming stubbornly in the hard-baked soil, roots deeper than the drought could reach. The stars wheeled overhead, quiet and constant, and in their ancient language they whispered the truth of it. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. Morning came slow and gray, stretching thin light across the uneven boards of the inn's porch. Laura Bullion blinked herself awake, stiff and chilled, her shawl barely warding off the creeping cold. The town yawned to life around her, shutters creaking open, boots thudding down steps, voices already rough and businesslike. No one spared a glance her way. She rose, brushing the dust from her skirts, and lifted her chin. Pride was a strange thing, heavy and hollow, but it was all she had left to wear. The baker's shop was the first place she tried. Its windows steamed with the promise of bread and coffee, and Laura Bullion's stomach pinched tight with longing. Inside she offered her services, cleaning, scrubbing, anything honest, but the woman behind the counter, plump and pink-faced, barely concealed her sneer. Her eyes flicked to the cross swinging gently at Laura Bullion's throat, and her mouth pressed thin. "Already got help," she said. Though Laura Bullion saw no one else there. The door shut harder than necessary behind her. At the dressmakers, at the livery, at the boarding house, it was the same. Smiles that slipped off faces like oil on water the moment they saw her, conversations that ended mid-sentence, hands waving her away as if she carried some sickness in her blood. The cross burned cold against her skin, a reminder, a burden, a brand. At noon, she sat on the low stone wall that bordered the mercantile and picked at the crust of a biscuit she had bought with the last of her coins. Children played in the street, their laughter bright and careless. A group of women passed by, skirts rustling like dry leaves. Laura Bullion caught scraps of their conversation, the words cross and cursed floating sharp and unkind on the wind. She pressed the silver charm into her palm until it left a dent against her skin. There were kindnesses, small and scattered like wild seeds. Mrs. Porter, the widow who ran the town's library, paused in her slow, careful walk to offer a wrapped bundle, a heel of bread and a soft-boiled egg, and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Some folks don't remember what it's like to be a stranger," she said, voice as creaky as her knees. "You hold on, child. Good soil's deep down. Just gotta plant your feet and wait." Laura Bullion thanked her with a voice that wobbled and tucked the bundle into her satchel like treasure. Later, as the sun sagged low and the town began to drink itself into evening, she found herself wandering to the edge of town where the land opened up wide and wild. There, on a small hill, sat a tiny chapel, its white paint peeling like sunburned skin, its windows clouded by years of dust. A cross stood crooked above the door, simple and worn. She stepped inside, her boots scuffing soft against the wooden floor. It smelled of old wood and older prayers. No one was there. Only silence and motes of dust hanging heavy in the air like suspended breath. Laura Bullion knelt at the rough pew and let herself break, not loud, not violent, but slow and aching. She prayed without words, her hands clutching the cross at her throat, her heart offering up all the loneliness and shame it could carry. When she rose, her eyes were clearer, her spine straighter. Outside, the horizon burned with the last fire of day, painting the prairie in molten golds and deepening blues. She stood a long moment, watching the sky swallow the sun, and promised herself she would not leave. Not yet. Not until she knew for certain there was nothing left here worth fighting for. Down the main street, Nathan Hale watched her from the shadows. He leaned against the hitching post outside the saloon, hat pulled low, nursing a mug he hadn't drunk from in an hour. He had seen her arrive, seen Griggs turn from her with a face full of small cruelty, seen the way she held herself against the stairs like a soldier on a battlefield. Nathan had known many kinds of strength, the loud, boastful kind that swaggered through the saloon doors, and the quiet kind that built fences in the rain and buried loved ones with steady hands. Laura Bullion wore the latter like a second skin. He hadn't spoken to her yet. Didn't know what words would matter or if any would. But he watched. 2 days later, Laura Bullion found work. Mrs. Porter needed help sorting the books in the library, dusty, crooked shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten knowledge. Laura Bullion worked without complaint, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair pulled back, fingers smudged with dust and ink. She found small joy there among the books, stories that didn't care about crosses or whispered judgments, worlds where girls like her could be queens or heroes or saints. Sometimes the town's children wandered in. One afternoon, as a storm brewed heavy and green over the plains, little Sadie Lynn, no more than 6 years old, with a tangle of blonde hair and a gap-toothed grin, tiptoed up to Laura Bullion and thrust a crumpled wildflower into her hand. "For you," she said shyly before darting away. Laura Bullion pressed the flower between the pages of a worn Bible, letting the petals dry and flatten like a pressed piece of hope. The storm broke that night, wild and sudden. Rain slammed against the inn's roof, lightning slashed open the sky, and thunder shook the bones of the town. Laura Bullion huddled beneath the thin blanket the innkeeper had finally loaned her and listened to the world tear itself apart. In the morning, the streets were rivers of mud, wagons stuck up to their axles, chickens squawking indignantly from rooftops. Men cursed and women shook out sodden rugs, and the whole town smelled of wet wood and bruised earth. Laura Bullion helped where she could. She hauled sandbags for the church, mopped the mercantile's flooded floor, soothed a frightened colt trapped in a half-collapsed stable. Still, most folks only muttered their thanks and avoided her gaze. Some even crossed themselves when she passed, as if her cross might leap from her throat and curse them where they stood. Nathan Hale watched. And thought. He watched the way she set her shoulders and worked harder when rebuffed. Watched the way she knelt in the mud to pull a sobbing child free from a stuck cartwheel. Watched the way she pressed a hand to her cross not in shame, but in silent defiance, in memory of something precious and pure. The town might have turned its back on her. But Nathan saw her. He saw the stubborn dignity threaded through her like the veins of iron that laced the mountains beyond the town. He saw the loneliness tucked into the corners of her smile, the kindness she poured into a world that offered her little in return. And deep in the marrow of him, something shifted. Quietly, like a seed cracking open in the dark, ready to reach for light. Laura Bullion, for her part, noticed the quiet rancher too. She noticed the way he tipped his hat when he passed her, a gesture no one else bothered to spare. She noticed the way he stayed back during the storm, helping others with a calm steadiness, never raising his voice, never asking for thanks. She noticed the way he spoke little but said much with the way he looked at people, as if weighing their hearts rather than their appearances. It was not love that stirred between them yet. It was something older, quieter, and perhaps stronger, recognition. On the third evening after the storm, as the sun dipped low and painted the puddles gold, Laura Bullion found a basket resting on the inn's porch. Inside were 2 loaves of bread, a jar of honey, a bundle of candles, and a folded note tucked between them. No signature. Just 5 words written in a firm, steady hand. For when the cold sets in. Laura Bullion stood there a long time, the basket cradled against her hip, the cross warm against her skin, the note trembling in her fingers. She lifted her face to the sky, felt the cool kiss of the breeze against her cheeks, and for the first time in a long while she smiled. Small, uncertain but real. Somewhere nearby, Nathan Hale tipped his hat and rode away into the deepening twilight, leaving only hoofprints and possibilities behind. The town might have turned its back. But maybe, just maybe, not everyone had. The days lengthened, stretching like soft taffy under the slow warming of the prairie sun. Spring hinted at itself in the tender green shoots poking stubbornly through the battered earth. Laura Bullion moved through the town like a spirit now, seen but not touched, whispered about but rarely spoken to. She took small cleaning jobs where she could, mended torn seams, wiped dust from cracked church pews, swept the floors of places that would not give her shelter but didn't mind her hands if they worked quietly enough. She asked for nothing but the dignity of honest labor, and even that sometimes felt like too much to hope for. Still she stayed. Because hope, once lit, is a hard thing to snuff out. And because sometimes a soul, having been turned away too often, roots itself not from stubbornness but survival. Nathan Hale saw her in the mornings, sweeping the boards outside the mercantile before the owner rose from sleep. He saw her patching Mrs. Porter's roof when no man in town had offered help, balancing precariously with a hammer too large for her hand but a resolve too large for her slight frame. He saw the way she would crouch to speak to Sadie Lynn, listening with her whole face, as if the words of a 6-year-old were a scripture she was honored to hear. Nathan was not a man who rushed at things. Not horses, not storms, not people. He had learned young that some things, the best things, needed time to trust to reveal their worth like a river carves a canyon one patient year at a time. And so he watched. And waited. Until the day came when waiting was no longer enough. It was a Thursday when the ranch hands at the broken spur began to mutter about needing help with the spring lambing. Laura Bullion heard of it secondhand, in whispers while she scrubbed the church steps. She wiped her hands on her skirt and approached the foreman herself, asked if they might need someone for cleaning, cooking, tending the new foals. The foreman barked a laugh in her face, a cruel noise that startled the sparrows from the rafters. "Don't need no cursed girl near the stock," he said, loud enough that the men around him chuckled, mean and hollow. "Bad luck's worse than wolves this time of year." Laura Bullion bowed her head, swallowed the stone of shame that lodged in her throat and walked away. It was Nathan who found her near the well, hands clutched tight around the wooden crank, body trembling with the effort to hold in tears. He didn't speak right away. Just stood a few feet off, letting his presence be enough. Not forcing, not demanding. Just waiting. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were dry but full of the kind of hurt that did not need water to wound. "I ain't a skin for pity," she said, voice low, raw. "I know," Nathan said simply. They stood like that for a long breath of a moment, the breeze tugging at her skirt, at the loose strands of hair that framed her tired face. In the distance, the fields rippled in soft green waves, and somewhere a hawk wheeled lazy circles against the wide-open blue. Nathan cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "Could use help at my place," he said. "Nothing fancy. Chickens need tendin'. Garden could use a hand." Laura Bullion studied him, wary. "Not charity," he added, voice steady. "Pays fair. Works honest." And something in the way he said it, quiet, offering but not pleading, made her nod. She followed him back to the edge of town where the land spread out like a story waiting to be written. The ranch house small but sturdy, the fences neat, the barn solid against the pressing sky. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't grandeur. But it was a life built board by board, seed by seed, honest and whole. The work was hard, but Laura Bullion took to it like a seed to soil. She mucked stalls, fed the chickens, patched fence lines alongside Nathan. They spoke little at first, but it was a comfortable silence, like the hush that falls between verses of a well-loved hymn. Over time, words bloomed slowly between them, small, hesitant at first, then stronger. Nathan told her about his sister, Leah, gone to fever 2 winters past, and how he still left her room untouched because some memories were too sacred to disturb. Laura Bullion in turn told him about her mother, about the mornings spent bent over mending baskets just to buy a day's worth of bread, about the lullabies sung by firelight when the world outside felt too cruel to bear. She told him about the cross. "My mama gave it to me," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun bleed itself out across the horizon. Said it was a reminder. Not of sermons or saints, but of love. Of carrying each other when we can't walk alone. Nathan didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked, and in his gaze there was no pity, no judgment. Only understanding. Only the kind of knowing that comes from carrying heavy things alone for too long. The silence stretched warm between them, thick with things that didn't need saying. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough-edged. "Seems to me," he said, "the world could use more folks who remember to carry others." After that night something shifted. Not fast, not dramatic, but slow and sure, like the turning of a river's course. Nathan began leaving small offerings where she would find them. A sprig of lavender tied with twine on the kitchen table, a smooth river stone left on the fence post, a jar of wild honey set on the windowsill. Laura Bullion, in return, mended his shirts with careful stitches, baked his bread with extra care, planted marigolds by the doorstep to ward off bad spirits, though she knew it was not superstition she was fighting but loneliness. One evening, a sudden storm rolled in off the plains, wild and fierce. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing shingles from roofs and uprooting the garden Laura Bullion had so carefully tended. She ran into the storm without thinking, battling the elements to save what she could, wrestling tarps over the henhouse, chasing loose boards across the yard. When Nathan found her, she was knee-deep in mud, hair plastered to her face, hands raw and bleeding. He didn't scold. He didn't shout. He just grabbed her hand, pulled her close, and together they fought the storm, side by side, breath by breath. When at last the winds died and the rain slowed to a sullen drizzle, they stood panting in the wreckage, soaked to the bone, caked in mud, laughing breathless, wild laughter born from relief and stubbornness and the strange, defiant joy of survival. Nathan cupped her face in his hands then, gentle as the first kiss of spring on winter-worn earth. "You're something fierce," he whispered almost in awe. Laura Bullion smiled through the tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. Just stubborn, she said. But Nathan shook his head, slow and sure. No, he said. You're brave. It wasn't a Delora Bullionshin. It wasn't a confession. It was simply truth, offered without demand, received without fear. That night, Laura Bullion sat by the fire, wrapped in a dry quilt, sipping broth Nathan had made with his own calloused hands. The warmth seeped into her bones, into the hollow spaces grief had carved, filling them not with grand promises but with the quiet, steady certainty that here, in this battered house, on this battered land, she was seen. Not as a burden. Not as a mistake. But as something rare. Something worth saving. Something worth standing beside when the storms came howling. Outside, the world dripped and shivered under a sky slowly clearing to stars. Inside, by the crackling fire, Laura Bullion touched the cross at her throat, feeling its familiar weight against her skin, but for the first time in a long while, it felt lighter. Because some burdens shared lose their heaviness. And some hearts, once broken, find new ways to beat again, not despite the cracks but because of them. Nathan sat across from her, fixing a broken boot with slow, methodical care, the firelight catching the gold in his hair, the quiet strength in his hands. Laura Bullion watched him, heart swelling with something too vast for words. Hope perhaps. Or maybe love. But not the kind that burns hot and fast and leaves ashes in its wake. No, this was the kind of love that rooted deep, twined around broken places, grew steady and slow like ivy on an old stone wall. The kind that stayed. As the fire burned low and the night deepened, Nathan looked up and caught her gaze. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. In the hush between them, in the crackle of the flames and the soft sigh of the wind against the windows, a promise bloomed, fragile, fierce, and unspoken. They would carry each other. And it would be enough. The days that followed carried a strange, golden hush, like the prairie itself was holding its breath. The storm had stripped the land bare, battered it raw, but in its aftermath, everything felt sharper, cleaner, more honest. Shoots of green pierced the broken soil, wild and stubborn, and in the mornings, the world smelled of wet earth and promise. Laura Bullion rose with the sun now, working alongside Nathan without needing to speak what had already been understood between them. Side by side, they mended fences, replanted gardens, coaxed life back into the wounded land. She wore his old work gloves, the fingers too big, and he sometimes carried a wildflower tucked behind one ear, a silent, boyish kind of offering he never spoke of. The townspeople watched, of course. Small towns always watch. Some shook their heads at the sight of her, the girl they had turned their backs on, now standing straight and unashamed beside a man they all respected but never truly understood. Others muttered darker things, blaming the storms, the poor harvest, the unexpected deaths of livestock on the girl who dared wear a cross around her neck like a battle flag. But there were quieter voices too. Mrs. Porter leaving fresh eggs on the porch without a word. Sadie Lynn dragging her little brother up the dirt path just to wave at Laura Bullion from the fence line. The preacher's wife nodding stiffly as she passed, a silent truce offered in the nod. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was enough to keep breathing for. It was a Wednesday when the last stone was laid on the new corral fence, the sun a heavy weight overhead, baking the sweat into Laura Bullion's hair and browning Nathan's arms a deeper shade of leather. She leaned against the rail and wiped her forehead with the hem of her apron, laughing breathlessly as Nathan dropped the hammer with a triumphant grunt. That there, he said, hands on his hips, surveying their work with satisfaction, might just be the finest crooked fence in all of Dakota Territory. Laura Bullion laughed, a real spilling laugh, and he turned at the sound, that slow, rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It would have been easy to let it stay like that. Easy to drift into something comfortable, to build a life brick by brick without ever daring to name what pulsed between them. Easy but not true. Nathan, for all his silence, was not a man who shied from truth. The next morning he shaved clean, combed his hair back from his forehead, put on his best, if still well-worn jacket, and saddled his horse with hands that shook more than they should have. He rode into town with the sun at his back and dust in his wake. At the general store, at the blacksmith's forge, at the steps of the church, men looked up from their work, tipping hats or raising eyebrows. Women paused in hanging laundry or drawing water, tongues already busy crafting the story before it had even begun. Nathan didn't care. He tethered his horse outside the small chapel and walked up the steps, boots striking hollow echoes against the wood. The door creaked open under his hand, and there, kneeling in the front pew, was Laura Bullion. She turned at the sound, surprise flickering across her face, then softening into something warmer when she saw him. He stood there for a moment, hat in his hands, heart hammering against his ribs like a bird desperate for flight. No grand speeches came. No pretty words or promises dusted with gold. Just Nathan Hale, a man who had lost too much and found something worth holding again, standing before her in the quiet hollow of that battered church. "I don't reckon I'm much of a prayer," he said, voice rough. "But I figure, if a man knows something good when he sees it, he ought to have the guts to hold on." Laura Bullion rose slowly, the hem of her simple dress brushing against the worn floorboards, the cross around her neck catching a shard of sunlight and setting it ablaze. Nathan stepped closer, heart in his throat. "I ain't offering much," he said. "Just a roof that leaks sometimes and fields that need mendin' more often than not. Just a man who'll stand with you when the sky turns dark and folks turn mean. A hand to carry the heavy things. A place you don't have to carry that cross alone." Laura Bullion's breath caught in her chest. She pressed her fingers lightly to the cross at her throat, feeling the familiar ridges, the worn metal warmed by her own skin. She saw it in his eyes, the fear, the hope, the raw, open need not to save her but to walk beside her. And in that moment she understood. Home was not a place. It was not safety offered on condition or love given for a price. It was standing before someone, battered and bowed, and finding that their arms were open anyway. Laura Bullion stepped forward, slow and sure. "You never saw it as a burden," she whispered. He shook his head. "Never." Her fingers closed over his, still rough from the rains, from the work, from living hard and honest. And when she smiled, small, trembling, fierce, it was like the whole tired, stubborn town bloomed around them, silent witness to something stronger than storms, stronger than spite, stronger than fear. Nathan drew her hand to his chest, pressing it there like a vow. Behind them, the chapel door creaked again, and they turned to see Mrs. Porter slipping in, her hands folded primly, her face crinkled in something very near a smile. And then Sadie Lynn, peeking shyly from behind the pews, clutching her brother's hand. And one by one others came, few but enough. A gathering of broken, stubborn souls who understood that sometimes you chose to stand, even when the world told you to turn away. The preacher dusted off his good book and cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he spoke the words that stitched their hearts together under the open rafters and the watching sky. There was no grand celebration, no feasting or fiddles. Just two souls choosing each other against all odds, against all fears, against every whisper and every sideways glance. Later, on the porch of their ranch house, their house now, Nathan carved a tiny cross above the doorframe with careful hands, the wood curling away in delicate shavings, a silent promise etched into the bones of their home. Not as a symbol of curse, but of carrying, of memory, of love that bore weight and found it light because it was carried together. Laura Bullion stood beside him, the silver cross still at her throat, but now it shone not as a burden or a brand, but as a beacon. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his hand over hers, steady and sure. The sky spread wide above them, endless and blue, and somewhere a meadowlark sang a song older than sorrow, older than shame. A song of things broken and mended. A song of things lost and found again. A song of beginnings. The prairie wind picked up, lifting the scent of wildflowers and fresh-turned earth, carrying it far and wide across the open land. And in that wind, if you listened closely, you could almost hear the world itself whisper. She was never lost. She was simply waiting for someone brave enough to find her.
The snow hadn't let up in 3 days. Not that Laura Wren noticed. She was too focused on the train window, too focused on her girl's shivering shoulders pressed into her sides, too focused on the crumpled letter in her lap, creased and stained with time, as fragile as hope itself. She had worn her best coat for this journey, olive wool, worn thin at the elbows. Her gloves had been patched twice, and her bonnet, well, it had seen better years. But she sat up straight, her spine unyielding, and told her daughters with a smile that the West would be a place of beginnings. "Do you think he'll be waiting?" asked the smaller twin, Lottie, the one who still believed in happy endings. Laura glanced down. "If he's a good man, he will." The other twin, May, didn't ask. She just stared at the snowy blur outside, eyes too quiet for a child of 7. That silence worried Laura more than anything. The letter said, "You'll have a home here. My land is good, my heart honest." It had come 6 months ago, and in those 6 months, 100 small things had gone wrong. Her brother's refusal to house her, the landlord's final warning, the church pantry's dwindling patience. She'd sold her ring for train fare, said goodbye to the only town that ever knew her name, and whispered to her girls that the west was kinder. The train hissed and wheezed as it slowed. Her girls clutched her skirts. The town came into view, not grand or bustling, but not desolate either. Wood buildings wore snow like shawls, and chimney smoke curled upward in sleepy spirals. She hoped it meant warmth. She hoped it meant someone had shoveled a path for them. She stepped off the train with her daughters in tow and looked for a man with a red scarf, the sign he'd promised. No one stood with such a scarf. A few men lingered near the platform, unloading crates, avoiding eye contact. A woman walked by briskly, clutching a baby wrapped in blue flannel. The station master nodded politely, but offered no greeting. Laura stood her ground for an hour. Her feet numbed, her hands stiffened. Lottie began to cry. May said nothing, only leaned into her mother and stared at the wooden sign. Welcome to Carver's Hollow. Inside the station house, the heat barely touched the edges of the room. The man behind the desk barely looked up when she asked after Mr. Roland Bell, the man she'd come to meet. He scratched his beard, flipped through a dusty ledger, and finally muttered, Bell? Oh, he married someone else back in September. Local girl. Didn't mention expectant company. Laura stared at him. He said he sent no letters, the man added. You sure you weren't fooled by some scribbler? She couldn't speak, couldn't cry, couldn't fall apart with her daughters watching. She thanked the man, because it was habit, and stepped back out into the snow. The town had turned colder in the hour she'd waited. She pulled the girls toward the inn, a square wooden structure leaning just slightly to the left. Inside, warmth rushed up from the floor, and her legs gave a little from relief. The woman at the desk gave her a long once-over. One night. That's all I can give. We're full up with traders and ranch hands. 3 beds, no firewood. You'll need to bring your own. Laura offered what coin she had, 6 bits and a Canadian penny. The woman eyed it, then handed over a small iron key. Room 4. Best eat now, before the stew's gone. The dining room was full of noise, boots stomping, spoons clanking, and the low hum of men speaking in curt tones. Laura and the girls huddled at a corner table. They shared one bowl of stew. The meat was stringy, the bread dry, but it was hot. Lottie whispered, Where's our home? Laura smoothed her hair. It's out there. We just need time to find it. The girls slept close together that night, curled into one another like pups, while Laura sat in the corner chair, coat still on, staring at the window fogged with frost. Her thoughts spiraled. She had no land, no man, no prospects. Just 2 daughters, and a name no one in town recognized. The next morning, the innkeeper met her in the hall. Checkouts in an hour. Rooms already spoken for. Laura nodded. Thank you for the night. It wasn't the woman's fault. Mercy had limits. She wrapped the girls in every layer they had and stepped out into the pale morning light. Her boots crunched through the snow, down the main street where shopkeepers swept porches with tired arms. No one looked up, or if they did, their eyes flicked past her like she was wind-blown paper caught in the eaves. She asked at the general store for work. The man said they didn't need help. She asked at the church. The preacher was kind, but vague. Times are tight. God watches, though. That afternoon, she sat behind the livery with her girls, sharing a heel of bread. They had found a dry crate to sit on, and the wind had less bite in that alley. Lottie asked, Mama, are we poor? Laura hesitated. We're just between blessings. May said, Does that mean no dinner? Laura didn't answer. She couldn't. A boot scraped against the gravel. She looked up. A man stood a few yards away, hat low, scarf dusted with snow. He didn't speak, just set down a canvas, sack near her feet, and turned to go. Wait, she said. He stopped. She stood slowly. Thank you. He nodded, then kept walking. She opened the sack, 2 loaves, half a salted ham, a block of cheese. The girls gasped. Is he an angel? Laura smiled, the first in hours. He might just be. She didn't know then that his name was Samuel Hart, a widower, quiet like the snow itself. That night, they slept in an abandoned storage shed near the church. The roof had holes, but the wind stayed low. She wrapped the girls in blankets, then lay down beside them, listening to their small breaths. Her thoughts churned. She had no choice but to stay. There was no train fare back. And even if there were, back meant hunger, pity, and no peace. Here, at least, no one knew her shame. The next morning, she knocked on the back door of the bakery and offered to scrub pots. The baker's wife let her in. No pay, but scraps. She cleaned until her arms ached, then left with a paper bundle of bread ends and burned crusts. Day by day she worked, quietly, unpaid. Bread here, stew there. She swept the church steps, mended a seam for the pastor's wife. She taught her girls to wait silently while she sewed by candlelight. A woman from the boarding house asked for help washing linens. 1 coin. Laura pressed it in her palm like it was gold. One evening, as she walked back to the shed with frozen toes and red knuckles, she saw him again. Samuel Hart, standing outside the general store. He looked at her, then nodded once. She nodded back. She didn't know his story yet, that his wife had died 3 winters ago, buried beneath a cottonwood tree on his land, that he'd closed off the extra room in his cabin and stopped speaking to neighbors, that he'd come into town once a month, bought what he needed, and left without words. He didn't offer help, just acknowledgement. It was more than the town had given. One night, Lottie coughed through her sleep. Laura sat up, her heart racing. The child's cheeks were too red, her fingers cold. She wrapped her close and prayed for morning. When light broke, Laura ran to the doctor's office. He was busy, said to come back after supper. She returned at dusk, coin in hand. She's just cold. Keep her warm, and she'll be fine. Laura left with the coin still clutched. She bought firewood instead. That night, there was a knock on the shed door. Samuel Hart stood there, holding a bundle of kindling and a small cast-iron stove. Had this in storage, he said. Laura didn't know what to say. He placed it down gently, then left. Later, when her daughters slept warm for the first time in weeks, she sat by that stove, holding the same letter that had brought her west. It crackled as she fed it to the flame. The past was gone. The dream was over. But her girls were warm. She was still standing. And that was something. Laura didn't count days anymore. Not since the shed had become their home and routine their refuge. Each morning began the same. She stoked the little stove Samuel had brought, boiled a tin of snow for tea, and gently woke the girls with a whisper and a kiss to their cheeks. She never mentioned the hunger. Some days brought blessings. Others, closed doors and eyes that wouldn't meet hers. But still she worked, scrubbing, stitching, baking pies from scrap ingredients traded in whispers and goodwill. She folded herself into the cracks of the town, quiet and persistent, like ivy finding its way through stone. The whispers didn't stop. Behind her back, she was the one who came for a man and got left in the snow. Women called her unlucky. Some crossed the street when she passed. A few pitied her, but pity was a weight she refused to carry. Her strength lay in her silence, in the way she listened instead of defended, endured instead of begged. She was not broken, just tired. The girls began to help. May collected kindling, careful with her fingers. Lottie, small but spry, ran errands for the baker in exchange for flour dust and sweet crusts. Laura sewed in the evenings by lantern light, taking in hems and darning socks for those who would trade food or coins. One afternoon, while trading a mended apron for 2 eggs, Laura caught sight of herself in the shop's dusty mirror. Her cheeks were pale, eyes sunken. But there was a steadiness there too, a quiet fire she hadn't seen before. She barely recognized herself, and she wasn't sure if that frightened or steadied her. Samuel Hart appeared again in small ways. A silent man with a careful gait, he would nod if their paths crossed. One morning, she found a split pile of wood outside the shed. Another evening, a jar of lard left on the steps. He never stayed, never asked for thanks. The girls grew used to his presence. That man with the kind face, Lottie said one morning, "I think he's watching over us." Laura didn't answer. But later that night, she placed a loaf of fresh cornbread wrapped in cloth on his cabin steps and walked away before the door creaked open. The town's rhythm continued around her. Sunday sermons, shop bells, wagon wheels, crunching frozen dirt. Laura stayed just outside of it all, never quite invited, never quite invisible. She was tolerated, sometimes nodded to, occasionally offered scraps of gossip or offhand advice, but never warmth. Not from the town that belonged to her girls, and quietly, to the man who asked for nothing and gave pieces of himself like he didn't want anyone to notice. Winter deepened. The snow thickened, the air brittle with cold. She bartered a pie for woolen scarves from the preacher's wife, whose hands shook from age. In return, Laura offered to read her scriptures aloud, voice steady, soft in the parlor where fire flickered low. "You've got patience in your soul," the woman said after the reading. "That's rarer than gold out here." Laura smiled but said nothing. Patience didn't fill bellies. A week later, May fell ill. It started with a cough, then a fever. Laura wrapped her in every blanket they had, tucked her against the stove, spooned broth made from bones and melted snow. Lottie tried to help, wiping her sister's brow, singing in a whisper. Laura stayed awake 3 nights straight. She begged at the doctor's again, offered everything, sewn goods, firewood, pies. "She needs rest." "Nothing else I can do," he said, then added, "You ought to think about sending her to someone better off." Laura didn't scream. She just turned and walked away. She couldn't give her child away. Not again. Not ever. That night, she wept for the first time in months. Head in her arms, the girls asleep, the wind outside louder than her sobs. The next morning, the shed door opened quietly. Samuel stood there, eyes moving past Laura to the bundle curled by the fire. Without a word, he stepped in and lifted May into his arms. Laura moved to stop him, but he shook his head. "She needs real warmth." "I've got it." Laura followed him through the snow, heart pounding. His cabin stood a mile out, nestled at the edge of the forest. Smoke rose from the chimney. The door opened into heat and space and the scent of pine and stew. He laid May in a real bed, tucked blankets around her, and stepped aside. Laura sank to her knees beside her daughter and held her hand until the girl's breathing steadied. Samuel said nothing, just stirred the fire and handed Lottie a cup of warm milk. That night, Laura didn't leave. She slept on the floor beside the bed, hand clasped around her child's fingers, the flames crackling steady behind her. In the morning, May's fever had broken. "You can stay," Samuel said. Laura shook her head. "We don't need charity." "It's not charity," he said. "It's shelter. You've earned it 10 times over." She didn't argue, not with her daughter breathing easier. The days after were a quiet adjustment. Samuel left early, worked the land, chopped wood, shoveled snow. Laura cleaned, cooked, and mended. She taught the girls to help. May now upright, slower, but laughing again. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was not awkward. It was respectful, like 2 people rebuilding from the same wreckage. One evening, Samuel came in from a cold, shaking snow from his coat. Laura was kneading bread. The girls were playing by the fire. He watched for a long moment, then said, "You've made this place feel alive again." Laura looked up, flour on her hands, and for the first time, didn't feel the need to apologize for existing. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the world in white. Inside, warmth held its ground. Later that week, Laura returned to town alone. She walked through the market square, now familiar. The butcher offered her bones for broth. The baker saved her the best end crusts. The preacher's wife called her by name. The whispers had changed. They no longer clung to her like frostbite. Now they drifted like smoke, faint, harmless, fading. She wasn't just the woman who came west and got left behind. She was the woman who stayed. And that made all the difference. When she returned to the cabin, the girls ran to her, scarves askew, cheeks pink. Samuel stood on the porch, axe in hand, watching the road. "You're late," he said. "I stopped to trade pies," she replied, brushing snow from her shawl. He smiled just a flicker. "I figured." That night, they ate stew around a table warmed by hands and quiet laughter. Laura looked at her girls, their bright eyes, their steady joy. Then she looked at Samuel, who never reached for her but always stood near. She thought, maybe this wasn't survival anymore. Maybe it was the start of something more. Laura didn't call it love. Not at first. She called it stillness. The kind that wrapped itself around her shoulders at dusk, after the girls were asleep and the fire had burned down to a soft glow. A kind of peace she hadn't known since before her husband died, before the long unraveling that had brought her here. It lived in the quiet moments, in the way Samuel handed her a chipped mug of coffee without asking if she needed one, in the way he let her speak or stay silent, both without expectation. There was no rush between them, no fluttering glances or awkward silences. Just time shared, measured not in declarations, but in small gestures, an extra blanket folded at the end of her bedroll, the way he salted stew exactly how she liked it, the way he left her favorite book by the windowsill on the mornings he rode out early. She hadn't told him her whole story, and he hadn't asked. She knew only pieces of his lost wife, child buried young, a man whose grief had turned into routine until it dulled him. But one evening, as the snow piled high against the cabin walls and the girls drew in the foggy window panes with their fingertips, Laura sat across from him at the table and asked softly, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Samuel didn't look up. He turned the page of his book, exhaled, and said, "Every day, until I hear your daughter's laugh." She didn't answer, didn't need to. That night, she found a scarf folded on her pillow, hand-stitched, blue thread, his initials in the corner, neat, quiet stitches. The next morning, she mended his torn flannel shirt, not because it needed it, but because she needed to do something for him, something small, something kind. The winter dragged on, relentless and beautiful. Each day began with chores and ended with laughter. The girls took to calling him Mr. Hart less and Sam more. Once, Lottie slipped and called him Papa. Silence followed. Samuel looked at Eliza, uncertain. Laura only smiled and kept peeling potatoes. The land outside remained frozen, but the space between them began to thaw. Sometimes, when the girls played by the fire, Samuel would sit beside Laura and ask about her favorite books. She'd mention old stories, tales she read long ago and thought forgotten. A week later, the exact book would appear on the mantel, left with care and no comment. She started writing again. Short things, letters never sent, verses in the margins of old journals, memories preserved not for pain, but for proof. One morning, Samuel found her scribbling and asked to read them. She hesitated. "They're not poems," she warned. "Just thoughts." He read them anyway. Then he folded the page, handed it back, and said, "You make grief sound like weather, something we live through." It was the first time she saw tears in his eyes. Just a glint, but enough. The cabin, once cold and functional, bloomed into something more. A red quilt appeared on the girls' bed. Candles lined the windowsills. Pine cones collected in bowls. A pair of snow boots gifted from the preacher's wife sat by the door, Eliza size, no questions asked. They began to feel like a family, though no one said the word aloud. One afternoon, Laura returned from the church with a basket of donated goods. Samuel stood outside, splitting logs, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. She paused on the porch, watching him. His movements were steady, rhythmic, like breathing. When he looked up and caught her gaze, neither of them looked away. She stepped forward and handed him a biscuit from the basket. Their hands touched briefly. She pulled back, but the moment lingered. That night, they sat close. The fire was low, the room dim. He read aloud while she stitched, his voice calm and even. "You read like you've lived it," she said. "Sometimes I have," he replied. The girls drifted to sleep early. Laura stayed beside the fire, the needle pausing in her hand. He cleared his throat. "I never thought I'd fill this house again." She said nothing, just looked around at the blankets on the chairs, the children's drawings on the wall, the sound of soft breathing behind the bedroom curtain. Then she looked at him and whispered, "Neither did I." In that silence, something passed between them. Not a promise, not yet, but a deep understanding that whatever had brought them here, pain, survival, grace, it had not been wasted. The days grew longer. The snow began to melt in patches. Ice dripped from a roof like a ticking clock. Laura found herself humming again, quietly as she swept, soft as she cooked. Her hands had loosened. Her shoulders had relaxed. Samuel noticed. "You sing when you don't realize it," he said one morning. "I used to before," she replied. "You should again." She smiled. She had learned to survive without needing anyone. But now she was learning to rest. One afternoon, he returned from town with a book wrapped in brown paper. No title on the front. She opened it at the table and blinked back a tear. Inside was a blank journal, the pages thick and inviting. "I thought maybe your words should live somewhere better than the margins," he said. She reached for his hand then. Not bold, not dramatic. Just quiet fingers brushing his. He didn't pull away. That evening, after the girls were asleep, she read him one of her entries aloud. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he said nothing for a long time. Then finally, "You write the way people pray." She didn't cry. Not then. But later, when he handed her a folded note, just a line of his own scribbled in careful ink, she did. "I never knew silence could feel like safety. Until you." She tucked it into the journal. They didn't speak of love. Not yet. But love had begun to bloom in the room's quietest corners. In the way he saved the last bite of stew for her. In the way she brushed snow off his shoulders when he came inside. In the glances. The shared laughter. The knowledge that neither of them owed the other anything. And still they stayed. One night, as a late frost blew outside and the girls giggled under blankets, Samuel sat at the hearth, Laura beside him, both wrapped in the same quilt. He turned to her and said softly, "I was wrong before." "About what?" "I said you reminded me of someone. But you don't. You're not like anyone I've ever known." She looked at him fully now. No fear. No shame. "You don't have to say anything," he added quickly. But she did. "I'm not like I used to be. I don't even know who I am anymore." "I do," he said. She took his hand. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind settled. Inside, everything changed. The last snow came quietly in the night. By morning, it blanketed the earth one final time, as if winter itself was saying goodbye. The cabin windows glowed gold from a hearth, and smoke curled skyward into a pale blue sky that promised warmth eventually. Laura stood on the porch, shawl wrapped tight, watching the road that led into town. She could hear the girls laughing inside as they braided ribbons into one another's hair. Their voices were no longer fragile. They sang now, even when they didn't know she was listening. Samuel stepped out beside her. He carried his coat over one arm, a clean shirt freshly pressed beneath it. "You nervous?" he asked. "A little." "They'll look. They always do. I'm not afraid of being looked at anymore." He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked to town on foot. Snow softened their steps, but the sky held no threat. Along the way, neighbors passed in buggies, tip-tats, and nodded. Some even smiled. No one turned away anymore. The story had shifted. And Laura knew it wasn't just hers. It belonged to every woman who had ever been cast aside and stood up again without anyone's permission. The chapel was warm with bodies and light. Music played low from a fiddle. Today was the spring gathering, a celebration of winter's end, of crops soon to be sown, of births and baptisms, and a reason to wear one's finest clothes. Laura wore blue, the same shade as the scarf Samuel had stitched that first winter. May and Lottie skipped ahead, their braids gleaming, dresses hemmed and washed with care. When they stepped into the chapel hall, conversations quieted, heads turned. For a moment, Laura felt the weight of every whisper from the past year pressing against her spine. And then Samuel reached for her hand, not discreetly, not in the shadows, but there in front of everyone. She looked up at him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The preacher smiled from the pulpit. The townsfolk shifted, made room. A woman who once avoided her gaze nodded and gestured for them to join her row. And Laura walked forward, not small, not sorry. Her daughters followed behind like grace made visible. The music swelled. Voices lifted in him. As the congregation stood, Samuel leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Will you dance with me later? If I remember how. I'll lead." After the service, Tables of food were laid out in the yard behind the chapel. Children played tag among the fence posts. Elderly men smoked pipes near the stove barrels. Women clustered together with coffee cups and warm gossip. Laura moved through it all with calm ease. She greeted the baker, thanked the preacher's wife, helped a young mother who dropped her shawl. No one recoiled. No one turned. By the time the fiddler started tuning again, Samuel was waiting near the center of the gathering, hand outstretched. Laura didn't hesitate. They danced slowly at first. He held her with care, not claiming her, but honoring her. Around them, others began to join, couples, old friends, even children. Someone clapped. Then another. The music picked up. Laura laughed aloud, a clear sound that startled even her. Samuel smiled. "You're different," he said. She nodded. "I think I finally believe I'm allowed to be." As the music ended, the townsfolk applauded. Samuel didn't let go of her hand. Then, without pomp or pretense, he knelt before her. Gasps echoed. The twins froze wide-eyed. Eliza's breath caught. He pulled no ring from his coat, only looked up at her with quiet conviction. "This isn't for show. You already saved my life. I'm just asking for permission to spend the rest of it proving I'm worthy of that." Laura didn't answer with words. She bent down, took his face in her hands, and kissed him. Not for the town, not for the twins, but for herself. The wind blew gently, stirring the melting snow at their feet. The moment held. Then Lottie hooped, and May giggled, and the crowd erupted with warm laughter and clapping. Samuel rose. Laura stood beside him, no longer in his shadow, but beside him, where she belonged. Later that evening, when the crowd had thinned and stars appeared like silver nails in a violet sky, Laura stood at the cabin porch again. She watched the snow recede in patches on the distant fields. The girls slept inside, their hands still sticky with pie, and their faces sunburnt with joy. Samuel joined her, wrapping his arm around her waist. She leaned into him and whispered, "Do you think they'll forget what I was?" He shook his head. "No, but I think they'll remember what you became more." They stood in silence for a long time. Then, softly, she said, "I used to be afraid of being seen. And now I see myself." He kissed the top of her head. She smiled, and the wind whispered its approval. So if the world ever tries to make you smaller, if it laughs when you arrive on the wrong train, if it slams doors and turns backs and calls you too late, too poor, too shamed, remember Laura Wren. She crossed winter alone, with 2 children and no promises, and still found a way to be someone's miracle. And if you are someone who's been cast aside, who eats in corners and walks roads no one shovels, know this: even snow melts. Even hearts, when tended with patience, thaw. You don't need to be rescued. You just need to be seen. And you will be, one day, when the world's ready for the kind of strength that never had to raise its voice to be heard.